along the old Black Nile. My ancestry and history is calling me. Come on, let's see, hey, just how it used to be. Hey, come along with me. Let your spirit run free along the old Black Nile.
Yes, indeed. Welcome, Washington, D.C. This is Tony Browder with the latest edition of the Browder File here on WPFW. It's my honor to be with you, and I am just so happy. I am just so elated. You know, I want to thank everyone who pledged on my show last week. Last Wednesday was my first pledge drive here at WPFW, and to be quite honest with you, I was a little nervous. I was hoping that my people would come through and help me meet my goal of $500. But I was just looking at the spreadsheet just a half an hour ago, and I was blown away. I was told that I had exceeded my goal, but I never got the final numbers as to how much we exceeded my goal by until just a few minutes ago. So the spreadsheet says that my callers, those who pledged on the Browder File show last week, pledged a total of $1,939. I am blown away. I am honored. I am so thrilled beyond measure. And so that puts pressure on me this week to make our minimum goal of $500 and hopefully, if all goes well, to even exceed that. So I want to thank my pitch partner from last week, Brother Kaba, who helped me feel good doing this. And because of the fact that I believe in reciprocity, I live my life in accordance to the principles of reciprocity. So I was Kaba's pitch partner this past Monday, and we exceeded his pledge goal for his 2-hour show. So it looks like we're on a roll, and I thank everyone who pledged to our shows and who contributed to our programs. Brother Kaba's program on Monday, my program last Wednesday, my program today. And I want you to know that you're supporting us, but more importantly, you are supporting WPFW. When you give to us, you give to the station. When you give to the station, you make it possible for voices like ours to be heard. Voices to be heard not just here in Washington, D.C., but all across the world. So the reach of this station is broad, and I thank you all for helping extend my reach. And so as we get into today's show, I want to remind you that, you know, we lost a giant in our community 19 days ago with the passing of Mr. Neely Fuller on February the 1st. Last Thursday, Mr. Fuller was laid to rest in Quantico, Virginia. And on that same day, last Thursday, from 8 to 10 a.m., there was a radio tribute on a local FM station a little bit further down the dial to the right, where over 24 people called in to express their thoughts on the cultural significance of the work of Mr. Fuller and how his work influenced the work of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, someone who's no stranger to WPFW and someone who we love dearly. And one of the persons who called in to the Fuller tribute is my guest today. So today's show is going to be another show focusing on education. We've been doing a series of talks on the education of the Black child, but we're expanding our perspective of education to the education of the Black community, adults, and everyone in the community who can benefit from knowing more about our history and our culture. So our guest today is Dr. James Conyers, who is duly qualified to tell us about our history and culture. Let me just give you a little bit of information about our guest. I'm not going to give you a lot because I could, but I want him to tell you about his work, what he's doing, what he's done, and what he's doing. James Conyers, Dr. James Conyers, is a retired associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and he's the former director of Africana Studies at King University in New Jersey. He holds a BA in Black and Puerto Rican Studies from Hunter College. We'll talk about his time at Hunter College and the people he worked with there. That's an interesting story in and of itself. And he also has a NA, MA, and a PhD in African American Studies from Temple University. He was part of that team who worked with Dr. Molefi Asante, who has trained legions of scholars to go out into the world and spread the great knowledge of African people, history, and culture. His field of teaching and research includes African civilizations with a particular emphasis on ancient Nile Valley history, culture, and language. He is the first person of African descent at Kean University to develop an accredited course in the ancient Egyptian language, Medu Neter, and perhaps he can talk about that a bit. He's written a number of articles and numerous publications, and he's got a book that he's currently working on now that should be out soon, and that book is on Dr. Blyden, and he'll get a chance to talk about that today as well. Our brother has traveled extensively throughout the country, throughout Africa, throughout the Caribbean. And so it's my honor to share with the listeners of the Browder File Show here on WPFW, my friend, my brother, Dr. James Conyers. Come on in, brother. How are you?
I'm doing good. Hotep, brother. How are you?
I am wonderful, man. And, you know, I thank you so much for calling in to the show last week to offer your comments about the life and work of Neely Fuller, and then calling me afterwards. It's been well over a decade since we're
a lot grayer now.
We're a lot grayer, and I see we both have lost the hair on our head. So welcome to the club.
Right.
But you're looking good, brother. You look healthy, and you still have that spirit that I knew of you and saw when I would come up to New York to visit Dr. Clarke and Marimba and so many people who we have known and loved. So listen, let me just jump in and start today's interview by building on something that we talked about last Thursday. Today, February the 19th, falls in the middle of two important Black historical events. The first, the death of Khalid Muhammad on February 17th, 2001. And the second is the death of Malcolm X, February 21st, 1965. You have a connection with both of these. So I would like for you to share with our listeners your relationship with Malcolm and your relationship with Kean University and Brother Khalid Muhammad.
You know, it's interesting. In terms of Malcolm, some people, when I relate this story to Malcolm, and in fact, I was on a panel at Clarke House in Harlem with Les Payne and Ilyasa Shabazz, and I related this story. And every time I tell this story, some people say, well, it was by chance. I prefer to believe it wasn't by chance, it was by the direction of the ancestors. And my connection with Malcolm began this way. I was about 12 years old. This was the early 1960s. I'm not going to tell everybody how old I am now, but I was about 12 years old.
You're what, about 65, 66?
A little bit more than that, brother. But anyway, and I think this was 1961 or 62. I happened to be up in Harlem to visit, and I'll try to make this as brief as I can. To visit.
But you're a native New Yorker, though, correct?
A native New Yorker. I was born in Harlem Hospital. I often make a joke about that, saying, if you weren't born in hospital, you can't claim to be a bona fide Harlemite, you know. But I didn't grow up in Harlem. I grew up on the Lower East Side of New York, which people call Alphabet City, which was a wonderful experience, myself and people like Dr. James Turner and other people. But nonetheless, I was up in Harlem to visit my godmother, who was pretty well known in Harlem. Her name was Cleo Sims, and she was considered by many to be Harlem's milliner. She had a millinery shop at the base of the Hotel Teresa. And if you look at the Hotel Teresa now, today, that little spot on the left-hand side, if you're facing the Hotel Teresa, was her shop. Well known. She did hats for all the members of the various churches in Harlem. Everybody wore hats, right?
So just for context now, the Hotel Teresa is where Malcolm was assassinated.
No, he wasn't assassinated in the Hotel Teresa. He had an order. So he was assassinated at the ballroom, the Audubon Ballroom.
Audubon. Okay, so the ballroom is not in the hotel?
The ballroom is further uptown in Manhattan.
Okay. Thank you for correcting.
Had an office, which I did not know about, And in fact, brother Peter Bailey when I was with him not too long ago, had to remind me that Malcolm had an office inside the Hotel Teresa. When Castro came to New York back in those days, that's where they met at, in the office at the Hotel Teresa, right? So I'm hitting the corner of 7th Avenue. And if anybody knew Harlem back then, on the corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street, you had a Chock full of nuts restaurant and you had a Needix restaurant. So I stopped in Needix to get a hot dog, and then I ate the hot dog and came around the corner. As I came around the corner, there was this man up on a podium with a huge crowd around him, and everybody was listening. And the man, his presentation was so captivating, I was literally frozen, could not move. He answered all of my questions, even though I never asked one question. He answered everything. And so when it was over, the crowd was dispersing, and I asked the man in the crowd. Back then I was really shy, so even for me to ask somebody something was a monumental endeavor. So I asked the man in the crowd, I said, "Excuse me, mister," I said, who was that? And he said, "That was Mr. X." He didn't say Malcolm X, he said Mr. X, and I didn't know the Malcolm part yet. So I go into the shop and I speak to my godmother, and I asked her, who was that? And she said, that was Malcolm. So I got to put it together, the Malcolm X part. Well, at that particular moment, the ancestors must have been with me, because as I said, he answered every single question I had in my mind. And like you and probably other people, from the moment I can remember, I was asking questions for which I had no answer. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what it was. And Malcolm answered right on the spot. He wasn't talking to me particularly, but he answered all of those questions. He talked about the myth of Tarzan, and just right on the spot. So, okay, 2 weeks later, I'm back up in Harlem, and he gave me the courage to go into Mr. Michel's bookstore, which was right where the state office building is today, right? Up on top, because it used to frighten me to death. Because back in those days, as you recall, you couldn't say anything positive about Black people. And in fact, if somebody called you Black, that was enough for you to fight. If they called you African, you're ready to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
So I went into the bookstore. Absolutely true story. I'll never forget this. I'm looking at bookstore small. I'm looking around, and I look out the corner of my eye. Who's in the bookstore? Malcolm with 2 guys from the Nation of Islam. Incredible. I wanted to get out of that store so quickly because he didn't say anything, just had a little smile on his face. I wanted to get out of that store so quickly before this man asked me anything. Mr. Michaud comes over to me and says, "Excuse me, son, can I help you?" I said, "Oh, no, I'm just looking around." He says, "Come here. I got something for you." He says, "I want to give you 2 books, and I want you to take these 2 books, and I want you to read them and come back and tell me what you learned." The 2 books were A Glorious Age in Africa, and the other book was 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro.
With proof. Yeah,
I took those 2 books and I hurried up out of the store. And by the way, that was the one and only time I was ever in Michel's bookstore. I never came back because I was afraid he was going to ask me something about the books, and I hadn't read the books yet. By the way, in the bookshelf right back here, I have those same 2 books. Those were the first books that I got in terms of Black studies. And I knew I didn't know at that particular point. I later looked back on that point and thanked the ancestors, because that was the beginning of my introduction to what we call Black studies, which I call African studies. That was my introduction. About a month later, I met Dr. Clarke, right on the East Side. He wasn't even speaking. He was at an event at DeWitt Church on the Lower East Side. He was there, and somebody introduced him, and I happened to be sitting near him, and that's when I first encountered Dr. Clarke. From that point until later in the 60s, maybe 1966, I would not see Dr. Clarke. I was doing what all the young men in the neighborhood were doing, running the streets. But a seed had been planted. Let me just say this. I didn't know it then, but I know it now, but it was a part of me even then. I was beginning to get in trouble with my friends, not doing anything criminal. I'm talking about in terms of ideology, in terms of the things that I would say once I had read J.A. Rogers' book, and I was getting a lot of opposition, and people would tell me, and in fact, even up to this very day, certain people tell me this. well, I'm into my black thing. You're doing this black thing and so on and so forth. And I would have to tell them, I'm not into a black thing. Being black has to be in you. You can't be in that. This is who you are. And I began to understand, as Dr. Clarke would later explain to me. So I stopped the arguments with people that being black, being African, is not a matter of discussion. It's not a matter of nation, and it's not a matter of debate. It's who I am. There's no negotiation on being African. There's absolutely no negotiation on that. And I have to tell people, and I've told my students this, because every now and then, and I'll get back to the story, every now and then in a class, people would get up, a black person, and raise their hand. And when we would talk, the question at the beginning of the class would be, how many people in the class are African? And you may have one or two hands going up, which represented continental Africans in the class, but the rest of the class would not raise their hand, right? And so I would have to deal with that. And then every now and then we get a black person that stood up and would say, and want the class to know that they're not black, all right? And so my response would always be to them, then I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those of us who are.
And are willing to embrace it, right?
And willing to embrace it, right? So these were some of my early impressions, Malcolm X and Dr. John Henry Clarke. But before that, there's somebody that I must mention, very, very important in my life, still is important in my life, the jazz legend, Jackie McLean. I grew up literally in the household of Jackie McLean with Renee McLean, Vernon McLean, and Melanie McLean. It was in the household of Jackie McLean that I first met Ilombe Braff. Ilombe Braff had a jazz magazine, and he was there. I think we were 11 years old at that time. If you ever get Renee McLean on your program, he'll tell you about this, right?
Well, can you make the introduction? I would love to have him on.
As soon as we get off the phone, I'll do that.
Very good.
Okay. And he's a wealth of stuff, but I met Ilombe Braff there. But let me just tell you what was going on in the household and how we as young men learned so much and were introduced. And I think probably Jackie McLean helped inspire these questions I had in my head. On any given day in that household, Dexter Gordon is there. Sonny Rollins is there. Lee Morgan is there.
Oh, man.
Right? Billy Higgins is there. On any particular day, Romeo Bidden, Harlem Renaissance artist is. Now, as kids, they had no significance to us. We just knew their names, even though we ourselves were young musicians. In fact, Jackie McLean brought me my first trumpet. He called up Manny's store and sent me and Vernon McLean down to get my first trumpet because I was striving to be a trumpet player.
Okay.
And every now and then when Lee Morgan was there, we'd be playing blues march or something in the living room, and Lee Morgan would come out of the back room and say, well, you're not playing it right, and show us how to play it.
Oh, Lord. So you played with Lee Morgan, huh?
Just casually in the living room.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Priceless.
That would come out. When Renee will tell you all of this when you get him on the program, and I'll join him on the program.
Very good.
And so Jackie McLean was the first person who I ever heard talk about, this before Dr. Clarke, before Malcolm, who I ever heard talk about Africa with respect. So you didn't get that jive feeling like, jungles, cannibals, savages, with respect. And if you look at Jackie McLean's record history in terms of the albums he put out, he had an album called The Slave Ship. He had, and one of his other albums, I think it was Jackie's Bag, he had a tune called Appointment in Ghana. You know what I mean?
And I do recall, I have an album downstairs with Jackie McLean with the pharaonic headdress.
Right.
Saxophone. Yes, sir.
Exactly. We were at Town Hall when he won the Downbeat Jazz Poll. We were backstage with the musicians, with Betty Carter and with Freddie Hubbard and Gratian Moncourt III. But on any particular day, somebody was in the house. But let me tell you this.
Well, brother, wait, let's do this. Put a pin on that for 1 second. See, I didn't know we were going here, right? I thought we were going to talk about history. You're talking about jazz music. Okay, man. And this is the perfect place to do that here in WPFW. But look, I want to let our listeners know that you're listening to James Conyers, the son of Harlem, beautiful spirit, wonderful, phenomenal historian. You're listening to the Browder Files show here on WPFW. We are in the last stretch of our pledge drive. And so We did wonderful last week. I want to do wonderful this week as well. I'm encouraging you listeners to go online. I'm encouraging new listeners to make a pledge at WPFW.org. You can go online and make that pledge, or you can do a phone donation by calling 202-588-9739, 202-588-9739, or 1-800-222-9739. You can also text WPFW FM to 801-801. That is, you can text whatever amount you would love to contribute to my show, to the station. Text WPFW FM to 801-801, or you can do Cash App. Cash App is $WPFW FM Cash App. So I'm so thrilled that so many people saw fit to get me over my goal, almost fourfold last Wednesday. I'd love if we can do that again this Wednesday, but I'm grateful for every single dime that we receive, because your support of this station makes it possible for us to have conversations like this. You know, Brother James, I've known as a historian, and I knew he was a jazz buff. I knew that he, knew Renee McClain and talked a little bit, but I didn't know your history was this deep, brother. So let me turn the mic back over to you and finish telling us about your jazz experiences, and then you're going to talk about Khalid Muhammad at Kane University.
All right. So, on any particular day, as I said, any of the great jazz legends would be there. Talking about Sonny Rollins when he had the Mohegan, when he did the album, The Brooklyn Bridge, and all of that kind of stuff, on any particular day. But what I found most interesting, and this is where we learned our lessons, the conversations in the living room was not just about music. You did hear about that. Some of the conversations involving music was that white musicians made more than the black musicians, that kind of thing, you know what I mean? And I got to see all of the hard times that the musicians were going through in a lot of different ways. But the conversations were also historical and political, talking about the plight of Black people. I once heard Jackie McLean talk about the fact that there should be some kind of legal apparatus for Black musicians who face discrimination in various places to be able to address that. Many of them were having their cabaret cards taken away from, it happened to Monk and other people, where you couldn't do certain things. And a lot of it was the result of racial discrimination. I mean, beating up Bud Powell. He was never the same after those cops hit him over the head.
The same thing happened to Miles too.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. When he was playing, I think Miles was playing at the Village Gate or something down there, and it happened to him. Birdland, that's where it was at, and it happened to him. So from Jackie McLean, we got the rudiments of history and the importance of history. And again, you didn't get that sense that it was irrelevant. You didn't get the sense that it was, something that you shouldn't talk about, as well as Dolly McLean. Also, I told Dolly McLean, I think it was last year, we did a Zoom thing with her celebrating her life last year or the year before. And I had to tell Dolly McLean that it wasn't just Jackie. Her influence went well beyond the sharps and the flats. That's how her influence was, and she's still alive. She's still around. And we were together last year. I was up in Connecticut, and up for a funeral in the Bronx, and we were all together. But back to the history. So Jackie McLean gave me my first notion of the importance of history. It worked with my mind. I was very inquisitive anyway, and I was asking those questions. And then having seen Malcom and then meeting Dr. Clarke was the next step. It was Dr. Clarke. This was in 1966. I was pledging to a fraternity called Penance Grove Military Fraternity. And the fraternity was born in Black studies. Born in it. Everything that we did had to do with Black people. Somebody could walk up to you while you're pledging on any particular day and ask you what you did for Black people, and you had to have an answer. What did you do for Black people today? Things of that nature. And lo and behold, one of the instructors that came was Dr. Clarke.
Really?
One of the instructors. It was for many, but one of the instructors was Dr. Clarke.
So this was a historical fraternity, right?
Yeah.
All about the history.
It still exists, but it's not the same as it was. Just like everything else, there were forces that destroyed it. Dr. Clarke was one of the instructors, and so I got reintroduced to Dr. Clarke. So Later on, Dr. Clarke would say, listen, I want you to come to Hunter College. And I said, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. Maybe at some point I will do that. I got a job in the Postal Service. And after working a few years in the Postal Service, before I went postal, I knew I had to get out, you know. And so while I was working in the Postal Office, I went to LaGuardia Community College in Queens, got a BA in liberal arts, took all of the different liberal arts courses. And then I spoke to Dr. Clarke again. And Dr. Clarke said, I want you to come to Hunter College. And I said, I'm ready to come. So I go to Hunter College. I registered.
Was he chair of the Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies?
He wasn't the chair. He was only chair for, I think, maybe 6 months or maybe 1 year at one time. Dr. Clarke called the chair of being the chair of Black Studies, he called it the clerk's job. That's what he called it.
Got it.
He called it the clerk's. He said, I got to get out of this clerk's job. But he only did it one semester or maybe 1 year, something like that, right? So I go to Hunter College, and I'm waiting in the Black Studies department was in the old Thomas Hunter building at Hunter College. It wasn't where it is now in the new building. It was in the old building, the old Thomas Hunter building, right? So I walk into the office to talk about to my advisor to get classes. Lo and behold, this is like 1979, 78, somewhere in there, right? I walk in, and somebody tells me, he says, this sister over there is your advisor.
Oh, Lord.
And they said, that's Dr. Donna Richards.
That's when the relationship began. Okay.
Exactly. Jifa is a tiny little, Jifa might have been 1 or 2 years old, something like that. Jifa was little, you know. And so she wasn't Marimba Ani yet. Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
Walk over to Marimba, and I got these courses that I decided I was going to take, right? And maybe it was 1980, I'm not sure. But one course was called African Civilization. Another course was called Afrocentricity or something. It might have been 1980. I think Malefi might have just written the book or something like that. But I had already been at Hunter a year. And so she says to me, oh, I don't think you need to take that course. This is really for advanced students, right? So I walk away. And I come back and I said, well, what about this course right here? You know, I was already an advanced student. I had already done readings. I was already a part of First World Alliance. I was, I was the original member of First World Alliance. When First World Alliance started, I was one of the first 8 people in that audience, original.
Right, so, brother, let's put a pin in that because some of our listeners may not be familiar with First World Alliance. What is First World Alliance?
First World Alliance was an educational, political action organization in New York City, headed by Brother Bill Jones and Sister Kefa Nephis. And it lasted for many, many years. They brought all of the great minds in the Black community there. Brother Asa Hill, you name it. Brother Asa Hilliard, Dr. Clarke, Dr. Ben, Wade Nobles, you name the person, Francis Welsing.
Van Sertima. Yep. Anybody who was anybody spoke at First World.
Who was anybody. You name it. Felt Middleton, you name the person. They spoke at First World Alliance. So we were all being educated at First World Alliance. So I come back to Marimba the second time and I said, well, what about this course right here? She said, oh, no, I don't think that's for you. You know, I don't think you should take this course. I walk away and come back a third time. And she says, I said, what about this course, Dr. Richards? And she said, okay, I'm going to let you in the course. Well, that was the beginning of our relationship. I became one of the top students in the department at that particular time. And from that point on, she became my sister. We became very close. I'm the one who used to take Jifa to school, pick Jifa up. I mean, the relationships, that's another program. And maybe at some point you'll have me and Marimba on that program. But anyway, that was the beginning of my sojourn at Hunter College. So Dr. Clarke became my mentor at Hunter College. And I spent a lot of time with him, both at the college and even in his house. And with Dr. Clarke, of course, I met Dr. Ben and other people. But going back to the Lower East Side, there were other people who were important. Another important person, do you want me to hold on for a moment?
Yeah, hold on for 1 second. Let me just let our listeners know that it is the bottom of the hour. You're listening to Browder File on WPFW. Our guest today is Dr. James Conyers, just giving us a history about history, a history about music, a history about his life. So, brother, continue, please.
And another important person was Dr. James Turner. Dr. James Turner was from the neighborhood. And let me just tell you a little bit about the Lower East Side at that particular point in time. Well, another name for the Lower East Side where we lived at is called the East Village, East Greenwich Village. And in that neighborhood, it was a very vibrant neighborhood at one point in time. Not only was Jackie McLean there in the projects with us,
Hmm.
down the block you had people like John Lucien. You had Miles Davis lived a few blocks away at one point in time. Gratian Moncour, just you name the jazz artist. The famous jazz club, which we all attended, Slugs, was right down the block on 3rd Street and Avenue C. Slugs Jazz Club. That's the club that Lee Morgan was killed in.
Mm. He was shot by his wife, or
His wife. Yeah.
yeah.
Another story.
Mm-hmm.
And another point in time, if you get Renee on here, I'll tell you a little story about Lee Morgan that I don't want to relate right now, but it's funny. Things that Vernon McLean used to do to Lee Morgan, but that's another story at another point in time. But James Turner was an icon in the neighborhood. And we looked up to him. And later on, not at that particular point in time, because James was about 10 years older than me. And I already knew James, but he was a lot older than me. I had gone to school, public school, with his sisters and brothers, because there were 9 of them. James was the oldest of maybe 9 kids. And James became this icon for us in many, many ways. And then he went off, I think he went off to Northwestern, and he was there with James Bracey and some other people at Northwestern. And then from there, of course, he was recruited to start the program at Cornell University. And James and I, up until the time of his death, James and I were very, very close. We traveled together. We shot the breeze together. We went to plays together. We did a whole lot of different things together. And of course, when he passed, I was up there in Connecticut. I was one of the in Ithaca. I was one of the people invited up there. I spoke and other things. But James and I were pretty close. But the man's brain, as I tell people, James, and maybe I shouldn't say it this way, but I am going to say it this way, James was no punk when it came to himself or his people.
Absolutely.
I'll do that for now.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a part of my education in terms of these 3 colleges, I also attended the Harlem School of Africana Studies. And I think you may remember that. The Harlem School of Africana Studies, which came out of First World Alliance, was the educational institution. The teachers of the 2 different sessions of the Harlem School of Africana Study were none other than Dr. Clarke and Dr. Ben. All right. Now, I have a certificate in the other room. I prize that certificate as much as I prize any degree that I could have ever received from any university at any particular point in time. Having gone to school, even though I had already gone to school with Dr. Clarke and Hunter, but having gone to school and taking these particular courses with Dr. Clarke, one of the things that we learned in the course, and that they emphasize directly or indirectly, and I used to emphasize to my students, that Black studies is not simply a compilation of names, dates, and places.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Black studies or African studies, whatever terminology we want to use, is transformative. It turns Negroes into Africans.
Absolutely. Helps you become a born again African.
It is. It turns you into a born again African. That's why there's no compromise. There's no discussion. There's no negotiation about that. In that course, I became familiar. I had heard the name, but I didn't know very much about him. I became familiar with one of the great Pan-African scholars of the 19th century, who is little known, but who is monumental in our history. But most people know nothing about him. Even if you take a course in Black studies, you know very little about him. He was totally whited out of history for the most part. There is somewhat of a revival now in terms of his contribution, but for the most part, he's not known. People know, for the 19th century, people know Martin Delany and Henry Bibb and Frederick Douglass and, all of those people. They know very little about them. The person I'm talking about that I've concentrated a lot of my research and work in is Dr. Edward Wilmont Blyden. Blyden was one of the intellectual giants of the 19th century, bar none. That includes Delaney, and that includes Frederick Douglass or anybody else you might want to mention from the 19th century. Blyden, and I did a piece at Baruch College called Before Garvey, the Philosophy and Work of Edward Wilmont Blyden. It is because of Blyden that Garvey chose Liberia. It's because of Blyden and the work Blyden had done in the 19th century.
So what made Blyden such a unique personality in your mind?
Okay.
What are some of the top accomplishments of this great man?
I mentioned three things, but I want to give the listening audience a little bit about Blyden's history. Three important things: the African personality, African education, and criticisms of European Christianity. Those are what I call the essence of Blydenic philosophy. But Blyden was born in 1832 in St. Thomas. I actually went down to St. Thomas and I met somebody that you know. I can't think of his name right now. He told me that you had been down there at St. Thomas to meet with the Blyden Society in St. Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember his name right now, but he told me you had met with them down there when I was down. This is maybe 10 years ago when I was down there. He was born in St. Thomas to free a free Black family while all the other Blacks were enslaved. He lived in the Jewish neighborhood, Charlotte Amalie, the capital of St. Thomas. Now, how Blyden's family got free, I have no idea. I know they were originally from St. Eustatius, and in that migration with the Jews, they migrated to St. Thomas. That I do know, but how they got free, I don't know. Blyden received a Presbyterian education and eventually became a minister. However, like you, me, and so many others, he had an inquisitive mind, knew something was wrong, just didn't know what it was. So he wanted to continue his education. A friend of his named Reverend Knox of the American Colonization Society offered him an opportunity to come to the United States to go to Rutgers University Seminary to continue his education. Unfortunately for Blyden, when he got here, 1850, he's 18 years old, 1850, somewhere in there, 1850, the federal fugitive slave law had just been enacted.
Mm.
Blyden, fearing that he would be captured, taken south as, because they didn't care whether you were free or not. If you didn't have papers to show you could be captured and taken back, decided, he heard about a place in Africa that had just gotten its independence 3 years earlier in 1847. This place was founded in 1822. It's called Liberia. It was founded in 1822, but it's got its independence in 1847. Blyden heard about this place, and his friend, Reverend Knox, told him, you can continue your education in Liberia. Mm. It is in Liberia that Edward Wilmont Blyden becomes Dr. Edward Wilmont Blyden. Talk about transformation. He goes to Liberia as any miseducated Negro. You know, he's brought up in the church. He's buying into all of the things. He just feels something is wrong, but he doesn't know what it is, right? So he writes. And if you read my book, you'll see this in there. He writes, I'm going to Africa to educate my benighted brothers. My benighted brothers. And then he goes, talks about how backward they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
He gets to Liberia, and to his amazement, his perceptions of our people there begins to wane. And he begins to do some extensive study into African history and African culture as he's developing himself. He goes to a high school there called Alexander High School. And later he's joined, I'm skipping ahead, but later he's joined by somebody from here, Reverend Alexander Crummell over there. And the two of them together basically are the founders of Liberia College in 1861. All right. Now he's beginning to have doubts about everything that he's been taught by Europeans. Everything. In 1881, when he becomes the president of Liberia College, he wrote a treatise called The Aims and Methods of a Liberal Education for Africans, right? So let me just tell you a little bit about that, because I know I'm skipping a lot. This is another program. And
well, hold on, put a pin in that for a second, because I do want to remind our listeners that you're listening to the Browder Files Show. You're listening to Dr. James Conyers. Tell us about the history of brilliant scholars, the history of brilliant musicians. And we're also are on the tail end of our winter pledge drive. So I am asking those of you who would love to make a pledge to do so. We're looking for some first-time listeners, first-time donors to the station. You can go online and make a secure pledge at wpfwfm.org. You can also call 202-588-9739 or 1-800-222-9739. People are standing by to take your call. Or if you like, you can take the easy way out. You can just text WPFW-FM to 801-801 and make your pledge. Or if you're familiar with the Cash App, you can go to $WPFW-FM and make a contribution. Whether or not you want to make a small contribution of $89.3 or a larger contribution of $100 or a monthly contribution of $20, $50, you can do all of that. We're more than willing to receive your cash, your contribution, so that we can continue to offer you great shows such as the one that we're having today. So, Brother James, please continue. And we got about 10 more minutes.
Okay.
And you haven't even talked about college. You haven't even talked about
we can have a program.
University. So we are going to do another program. And see, you know, when we first had this conversation last Thursday, you were hesitant about coming on the air because you didn't know what you were going to talk about. I knew, brother, once you got started.
But it's even more than that. It's the fact that I don't like the sound of my own voice. That's,
I don't like the sound of my voice. I don't like watching myself doing the presentation. So I get it, brother. I do understand it. But let me just tell you, you are on a roll. The information that you've been dropping this afternoon has been phenomenal. You are a treasure. And believe me, you will be invited back multiple times, James.
Okay. Well, let me just talk about these three concepts that helped Blyden develop his whole worldview and philosophy in terms of Liberia, which attracted Marcus Garvey to Liberia. And I'll go through these really, really quick. Number one, African education. Blyden said that a European education miseducates the African person, teaches the African person to hate themselves. He said that an African education that brings the African home to himself, meaning your mind home to yourself. And so he developed a whole philosophy of what that education should be. And in fact, in the process of doing that, Blyden is one of the first people to write a history book on the history of Africa, where he mentions Kemet in the book as being an African civilization. It's called The Negro in Ancient History.
Okay. Now, does he say Kemet or does he say ancient Egypt?
He says Kemet. No, he says Egypt. But I'm saying,
sure.
He says an African education has to bring the African mind home to itself, and he elaborates on that. Second concept, and this brings me to our late brother and ancestor, brother Dr. Kobe Cambone. In his book, African Psychology in the American Context, talks more or less about the African personality. So Blyden says that the African personality is a distinct social and cultural entity. It is not a European personality in development. This is what he says. And so he rejected the whole idea that European anthropologists put forward that other people were developing a consciousness that Europeans already had, that we were beginning to develop, coming from savagery, barbarism, and civilization. It was kind of like the chain of being. Europeans were already at civilization, and many of the rest of us were coming from savagery to civilization, a concept that European anthropology had put forward about people of color, but especially African people. And the third major concept, and then I'm going to make a comment about this, was Christianity. Even though Blyden was a Presbyterian minister, he eventually left the Presbyterian Church and became what he called an itinerant minister of the truth, meaning a traveling minister of the truth. He said that Christianity, European Christianity, wasn't Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And what it was doing was, it was used to control the thought, speech, and action of African people.
Absolutely.
All right, now this comment I'm going to make now may get me in trouble with certain people. Contrary to certain things that I've been told by some of our Muslim brothers, Blyden never, ever said that the black man's true religion was Islam. He didn't say that. He respected Islam. What he said was, he said that Islam, as compared to Christianity, at least allowed African people some semblance of themselves. That's what he said. So it didn't totally destroy the African consciousness.
Sure.
That's what Blyden said. So anybody, I have not found any record, and I've looked extensively what Blyden said. Remember, he remained a Presbyterian minister, itinerant minister of truth, traveling around.
And if I'm not mistaken, you received your PhD by writing about Blyden, correct?
Exactly. This is the dissertation right here.
Okay, so you know of what you speak.
Oh yeah, it's in here. I have it all in here. So when I do those three aspects, everybody will get to read that, and see. So those were the three things in terms of the development of Liberia College and what he planned to do. But it was much more extensive than that. He looked at the arts and sciences. He wanted to develop those. And he saw Liberia as being the basic model for an African empire. And of course, this is certainly what attracted Garvey. Remember, during Garvey's day, there were only two independent African nations in Africa, Liberia and Ethiopia.
Yep.
And so Garvey read Blyden. And Garvey says this. Garvey said, you can't even know the history of the African race until you read Blyden.
So when did Garvey go to Liberia?
Garvey never went to Liberia.
He never went to Liberia. Okay, I thought I
Never
heard you
went to
mention that
Africa.
earlier.
He never went to Africa. Of course, Blyden was there. Blyden was in between in between Liberia and Sierra Leone. Blyden was so far ahead of his time, as Dr. Clarke used to tell me, he's ahead of our time. We haven't caught up to Blyden yet. And he held numerous positions in Liberia. Whenever people tried to kill him in Liberia, he went to Sierra Leone. When it got too hot in Sierra Leone and things cooled off, he went back to Liberia. So he is important to the entire history of Liberia. There's a statue of him in Sierra Leone, Blyden, because he respected the Muslim community and they respected him for his teaching in Sierra Leone. But his philosophy was monumental.
Did Blyden ever come to the United States after enslavement ended?
Yeah. He came as a result of his efforts to get Africans to repatriate to Africa, to Liberia. He wanted to build this African empire. He made between 4 and 6 trips. Unfortunately, especially, there was the 1854 immigration movement in Cleveland, Ohio, and many of the blacks, according to even Frederick Douglass, who was sympathetic in the beginning of going to Africa, decided that we had been here for a long time. We're going to cast our lot here, and we're going to try to develop ourselves here. So, but Blyden continually was getting people interested in going to Liberia to build this African empire in Liberia. But he was like kind of a one-man wrecking crew. He had very little help. And one final comment on that, because I know we have only a little bit of time. Many of the early Americo-Liberians that went, many of them were all passing for white. Something like the first 4 or 5 presidents of Liberia, if you look them up, they're all passing for white. And when they got to Liberia, they set themselves up in Liberia as white people, more or less, over black people. And of course, it created a lot of problems for Crummell and for Blyden. So they started acting in the same racial terms that they were subject to here in the United States. They reproduced that over in Africa. They didn't want the traditional Africans, repatriates and others, to even go to Liberia College.
Sure.
And unfortunately, one of Blyden's first wife was a mulatto. All right. He met her over there. And he writes incessantly to William Coppinger, the secretary of the American Colonization Society here in the United States, about what the mulattoes were doing. And this helped to influence Blyden's African personality theory. You know what I mean? He says they have no loyalty to African people. And it turned out that in reality, they didn't. All they wanted to do was get away from the American racial system, get to Liberia, and they reproduced it over there.
Created their own racial structure, racial caste.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to build a country. They were importing their food and clothes from the United States and from Europe, you know, and Blyden is thinking about building a structure,
Creating a nation. Yeah.
Creating a nation. And this, once again, is why Garvey saw Liberia as so important. And so, as I said in my lecture at Baruch College, before Garvey, there was Edward Wilmont Blyden, who laid a foundation and a structure. If you look at the writings of Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Monroe Trotter, and a whole host of other people, you'll see elements of Blyden in those writings. They were all creative thinkers, all original. Blyden had the whole package. He saw the whole package of what we call African redemption.
So James, you mentioned in the information that you sent me that you're currently working on a book tentatively titled Edward Wilmont Blyden, The Three Essential Concepts. Right. Where are you with that publication? When do you think it will be available?
Well, I'm hoping to have it available in the summertime.
Okay, before the end of the year then.
By the end of the year, exactly. I'm updating those three essential concepts, of course, are in my book here, my dissertation, but I'm updating those concepts and I'm going into it a little bit more deeply. And I'm connecting, I did in the book too, but I'm connecting it more to people like Amos Wilson, Kobe Cambone, their worldview and philosophy, Wade Nobles, and, you know, and even Asa, our brother Asa Hilliard. And, you know, I have a note in there somewhere the way I want to include, because Blyden was clearly saying this, but not saying it the way Asa said it. Blyden was clearly saying that what Asa said, to be African or not to be African.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Well, Blyden, I'll just read real quickly what Blyden basically said. And I have...
We got 1 minute, brother, 1 minute.
Let me see if I can find it real quick.
I love it. I love it. You know, last week you were apprehensive about what you would talk about, and today I can't get you to stop talking. Go ahead, brother.
What Blyden said, your place has been assigned to you in the universe as Africans, and there is no room for you as anything else.
Oh, I love it. Repeat that, please, please.
Your place has been assigned to you in the universe as Africans, and there is no room for you as anything else.
I love
so
it.
In essence, to be or not to be African.
I love it. I love it. You all have been listening to Dr. James Conyers from New York, from Harlem. You know, we were supposed to talk about some other things, but we didn't quite get there. So I'm definitely going to have you back. We're planning to do a series of programs on education of the Black people, education of the Black child, education of the Black family. So you certainly will be in future lineups. I want to thank you so much, brother, for calling me last Thursday and allowing us to reconnect. And this connection will not be broken. Like Marimba Ani's, you know, the circle has been reestablished and it will not be broken, brother.
Thank you so much. Peace. And let me just say one thing to you in Kemetic language. Dienek Anku Jusanimi Rajet. May you be given life, prosperity, and health like Ra forever.
Thank you, brother. And back at you. Thank you so much.
Peace,
so, like, let me give you some closing thoughts before we end this episode of the Browder File. You know, a number of people have succumbed to the fear that's been generated by 92 and his henchmen who seek to establish the Fourth Reich right here in the United States. But, you know, and the truth is that if you can't think straight when you're fearful, you can't think straight when you're fearful. You can only think straight when you are fearless. So I want to share with you, I want to close out today's program with a poem written by Claude McKay, 1919. It's a classic, If We Must Die. And the timing of this poem was significant because he wrote this poem during the time when Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States, when he oversaw the resegregation of the federal workforce. Woodrow Wilson screened the birth of a nation in the White House, and he was president during the Red Summer of 1919. 1919 was a critical year here in the United States of America. So if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while around us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mark at our accursed lot. If we must die, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy, shall we be constrained to honor us through though dead? O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. And for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What though us before us lies an open grave, like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So if Dr. King said, if a person has not found something worth giving their life for, they have not found a reason to live. So I offer to you, if we must live like men and women who are willing to fight from dusk to dawn. We must live as souls who understand that we carry within us the genetic memories of 10,000 souls free from sin. They live in us. They wait for us to live for them. They are our arms and hands. They are our eyes and mouths. They're brilliant brains. They're beating hearts. If we will live and live, we must. Let us live as men and women from dawn to dusk. Let us spend our nights preparing for the dawn when we will begin a new day, knowing full well of what we must do. So let us live, brothers and sisters. This is the Browder File. This is Tony Browder with another phenomenal episode. We want you to know yourself, your authentic African self, as Blyden encouraged us to do. But when you know yourself, you'll love yourself. And if you love yourself, you'll unearth all the beautiful things around you. And as Maurice said, if there ain't no beauty, you got to make some beauty. So Miss Nouveau, I want to wish you well. I hope you get out of the hospital soon. And Brother Khalid, you can take us home with Maurice White. And let us do what we must do. Love, 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 beginning with ourselves and everybody in our family. Peace. See you all next week.